Ars Amatoria, and more specifically how Ovid's love poetry subtly but clearly advocates the independence of sexual joy from childbirth, how we move from the importance of procreation to the importance of recreation in sex. So Latin love elegy, I'm going to begin by noting that Latin love elegy creates an autonomous and private domain for sexual affairs. The pleasure that results from love affairs is an end in and of itself. It is not a means for having a baby, actually. As Luc Roman argues in his fine book, Ovid's organization of erotic discourse intensifies the autonomous self-preservation of elegiac poetry. We get the sense, Roman adds, that love is played like a game for its own sake. So sex is no longer a means of procreation, but a source of pleasure. And pregnancy, as I shall argue in these papers, is dissociated from sexual joy and at times undermines it. Now, even though sex should be enjoyed independently from procreation, there is very little about contraception in the art of love. And this is quite striking. There is a cryptic reference to the douche water as a postcoital contraceptive measure in Ars Amatoria 3, and that's all. What about a pregnancy as a side effect of sex? Sharon James actually argues that the elegiac Puella's fear of pregnancy in Latin love elegy is subtly but clearly suggested, but it takes her an awful long time to make this argument, which I think is ultimately convincing, but not at all obvious. And even though Ovid famously, or rather notoriously, advises against abortion in two poems of the Amores, we often see pregnancy as something that deforms the female body in his elegies. Now, to some extent, the elegiac view of pregnancy as undesirable flies in the face of Augustan legislation. The moral legislation rewarded Roman women who gave birth to 3 legitimate children and penalized the celibate and the childless. It was quite extraordinary. So the contrast between the pleasurable but childless extramarital affairs of Latin love elegy and the pleasureless but fruitful marriages encouraged by Augustus's laws is not hard to trace, and it is pretty striking. But that's not the whole story. As Thomas Habeneck notes, the Augustan moral legislation was an act of cultural appropriation. It disembedded sexual behavior from its familiar context, where it had been traditionally regulated by the paterfamilias. Now, Latin love elegy plays a similar game. It aims to regulate love affairs between legally independent persons. Alessandro Barchiesi points out how remarkable it was for Ovid to conceive a panoramic text about love in Rome, the Ars Amatoria, without reference to family ties. Barchiesi builds on Eleanor Gorman, who discussed the polarity between love and the family in Ovid. And along similar lines, Gardner discusses the way in which Roman elegy configures the household, the domus, as a response to the reconfigurations of the Roman family in the Principate. By stripping eroticism of all family obligations, love elegy, not unlike Augustan legislation, disembeds sexuality from family ties. It thus creates an autonomous and private domain for sexual affairs. And this socio-legal shift is the key to what Habeneck calls the invention of sexuality in the world city of Rome. And here he clearly refers to Foucault's history of sexuality. So the elegiac poet is an uncanny reflection of Augustus. The poet and the prince aim at regulating female sexuality by laying down the law. And it is female sexuality that is their main concern, actually. The elegiac poet, not unlike the prince, is driven by a burning desire to manage, if not to create, the female body. But the auctor, the author of love poetry, stands in opposition to the prince's agenda, which was biopolitical. Its aim was basically to increase the population. While Augustus produced laws to boost birth rates, the elegiac legislator sees pregnancy as an obstacle in the pursuit of pleasure. In Latin love elegy, sexual pleasure is the ultimate goal. By contrast, pleasure was at best instrumental, or at times considered an obstacle in the conception of legitimate children. The divide between the childless but pleasurable affairs of love elegy and the fertile but pleasureless intercourse of married couples revolves around the emergence of sexuality as a discourse that dissociates sex from reproduction and disembeds the regulation of sexual behavior from its familiar familial context. So in Latin lavellage, childbirth is undesirable because, put it simply, it undermines attractiveness. And attractiveness is a necessary quality for the consummation of love in Latin lavellage. The Praeceptor Amoris, Ovid's persona as the teacher of love, deals with childbirth as he lays down the laws of love. In his instructions about sexual positions, for instance, that's the last part of book 3 of the Ars Amatoria, Ovid advises women with stretch marks from childbirth to adopt the reverse position as a means of concealing them. I will share my screen now so that you can see the handout. So can you see my handout on the screen? Okay, so this is number 1 on the handout. Tu quoque quirugis uterum lucina notavit, ut celer aversis utere partus equis. You as well, whose belly lucina has marked with wrinkles, ride the horse turned backward like the swift Parthian. The verb notavit here are highlighted because it is quite striking at the end of the hexameter. This verb does not simply refer to putting a distinguishing mark, but it refers to brand someone as a sign of disgrace, a sign of infamia. Someone is socially degraded when they are branded, and in particular that refers to the activities of the censors who used this mark of shame to degrade citizens. And that would be the nota that would be put against their names. And that actually, you can see this use in Ovid and in Horace and in Cicero, the use of notare. So what is going on here is that that creates quite a tension between the morality and the instructions of the Praeceptor Amoris. If childbirth is the badge of a woman's honor in Augustan legislation, it is a humiliating scar in the morality of love. The ugly and the shameful aesthetics and morality here are drawn together. The fact that the woman has to conceal the marks of childbirth in sex suggests her shame. Other than childbearing that deforms the body, there is nothing shameful in the sexual act in the Ars Amatoria. The allusion to the sensorial branding in the context of sex brings up the interplay between the public and private aspect of femininity. The public display of maternity is awkwardly exposed in the bedroom. Public virtue becomes a private scar. The goddess of childbirth is Lucina, and that's a name that was etymologized from lux, or from light. We see this etymology already in Varro. But here, that's Ovid's twist. Lucina brings to light not only children, but also stretch marks, and these need to be concealed. Note also the pun between uterum, the word for woman, utere, use, and the imperative of uter. In Ovid, the verb uti often implies the usus venerius, basically sexual intercourse. And here it's used to describe the sexual position of the mulier equitans. So in this context, the womb, strangely enough, gives birth to sexual joy, not children. A woman's body is a source of pleasure, especially if it has not been burdened with childbirth. Now, another fascinating aspect of this last passage on the sexual positions is that there are references to maternity, but these references appear in contexts that barely suggest motherhood. The instructor encourages his students to loosen their hairs and bend their necks so that their tresses go wild during sex. This is number 2 on the handout. Don't think it's a disgrace to let down your hair like the Philaean mother and bend your neck back while your tresses go wild. I guess there is the issue of turpe, which refers both to aesthetics and morality, something that it's ugly and something that is disgraceful, and Ovid is going to conflate those two things. But what about the example here of the Philaea mater? Who is this character? Well, that's most likely a Thracian Maenad. As Roy Gibson correctly notes in his commentary, both mater and matrona describe Bacchants in Latin poetry, both in Virgil, for instance, and Ovid. Now, but they're present as examples of wild sex in a work that supposedly excludes matrons and mothers is striking. What is more, this is matronly sex that stands in sharp contrast with motherhood. Agave, for instance, the most famous of the Thracian Minutes, is known not for giving birth, but for dismembering her son in a Bacchic frenzy. Now, here with the Phileia Mater, if that's a reference to Phyllis, actually, this is a heroine who was abandoned by Demophon, and then she turned into a Bacchant, as Ovid tells us in the Remedia Amoris, and then she killed herself. So if the Phileia Mater is a reference to this particular heroine, note that it is a reference to a childless mother. In the context of teaching women sexual positions, maternity appears as a synonym to monadic libido that is markedly divorced from childbearing. So the independence of sexual joy from childbirth lies at the heart of the art of love. The final instructions on sexual positions, that's the main focus of the presentation, revolve around a tension between the views of austere moralists who would recommend a certain position as conducive to conception, and on the other hand, erotic manuals that recommend sexual figura that give more pleasure. So you have the moralists on the one hand that talk about sexual positions to help women conceive, and you have the erotic manuals on the other hand that talk about sexual positions that give more pleasure. Lucretius, for instance, mentions the sexual position of the more ferarum, the doggy style in modern terms, but he mentioned this in reference to impregnating women. According to Lucretius, lascivious movements during sex are discouraged because they reduce the chances of conception. The Epicurean poet draws a distinction between sex workers who indulge in such motions for the purpose of pleasing men and avoiding pregnancy. So that's quite extraordinary. For Lucretius, sexual pleasure is a method of contraception, and thus wives have no use of it. Lucretius's advice echoes and contrasts with Greek erotodidactic manuals authored by famous courtesans. In these manuals, the pursuit of pleasure was the learning outcome of sexual instruction. Now, Ovid, as usual, stands in the middle of this tradition. His concern here is with decorum, and his talk about decorum and turpis actually aligns him with the moralists. But his focus on women pleasing men in bed continues the tradition of erotodidactic manuals. Though I should add here that Ovid's instruction on sexual positions stand out because they are equally concerned with the pleasure of both men and women. Ovid keeps coming back to this point that both men and women should feel equal pleasure during sex, and that was something not to be taken for granted. In any case, childbirth is out of the question. What is more, unlike Lucretius or the courtesans' manuals, the social and moral status of Ovid's women is notoriously hard to pin down. Is he giving advice to sex workers, to freedwomen, to matrons, to all of the above? That's notoriously unclear. The references to marital sex from Greek mythology as examples of appropriate sexual positions, Ovid refers to Milanion and Atalanta, to Hector and Andromache. All this add to the impression that Ovid here instructs all women from all social classes and blurs the lines that the law really needed to draw. So the Praeceptor starts his sexual instructions by declaring that not all positions befit all women. This is number 3 on the handout. The same position does not become everyone. One who has an exquisite face should lie face up. Those to whom their behind is pleasing should be seen from behind. So here his emphasis is on decet, on decorum, and that's really Ovid appropriating the discourse of the moralists, and their also interest in sexual positions for the purpose of conceiving a child. So after he introduces the decet and saying not all positions become all women, he introduces the 2 sexual positions, the missionary position and the more ferarum, the doggy style positions. And these are actually important because these are exactly the sexual positions mentioned by the moralists as natural to human beings. Artemidorus talks about the missionary position or as conducive to conception. We already discussed Lucretius for the more Ferrarum position. So Ovid is teasing us here that he's going to buy into this discourse of decorum of this position suits the married woman, the other position suits the prostitute. But actually, he's not doing that. Ovid avoids prescribing one position to all women while emphasizing that sex is for pleasure, not for childbirth. So he brings up the sexual positions that are supposedly conducing to childbirth in order to emphasize his departure from this concern. So what is important in Ovid? What is important is the beauty of the parts of the female body, not the chances of conception. And this is what dictates the appropriate sexual position. I have highlighted here the verb iaketo in handout number 3. That's the future imperative, and that's important because the diction here is very solemn. The future imperative is the language of an authoritative legislator. It's the language of legal injunctions, and that it simultaneously brings up a tension between Augustan legislation and the code of conduct that is advertised in Ovid's Ars Amatoria. So Ovid, this is the sort of simple grammatical form that juridicizes the preceptor's instructions. Now, in contrast with the demographic concerns of the Lex Julia and the didactic tradition of Roman moralists, Ovid asks women to assume certain positions in order to flaunt their beauty. According to the laws of Venus, sexual intercourse produces pleasure, not children. The second use of the future imperative in the final section of Book 3 of Ars Amatoria is actually more closely associated with the discourse of law and morality. This is number 4 on the handout, and I'm talking about Caveto here. So the second couplet, when he says, when you're faking it, just be aware you're not found out. Your motions, your very eyes should make it believable. So here Ovid is talking about women who are faking an orgasm, and say just make sure that your partner believes it. The funny thing is that here Ovid uses very solemn language. He speaks as a jurisconsult who prepares his client for an appearance in court. But note that the thing that is on trial is in Ovid's court of love is neither a woman's fidelity nor her fertility. What is on trial is the genuineness of her sexual joy. And so Ovid uses this legal diction in order to highlight his departure from the real concerns of the law, which was fidelity and fertility. In Ovid, the failure of the womb to give birth to pleasure is its true sterility. The first couplet in handout number 4 starts, and that's the couplet that laments women's frigidity. And note that it is framed by 2 words that suggest fertility and infertility. These are infelix and frui. Unfortunate the girl for whom that place is bland and numb, where woman and man ought to get equal enjoyment. That place is polite reference to the vagina. Okay, elegy is not anatomically explicit. It's not Catullus, it's not iambic poetry. Now, going back to infelix and frui, the primary meaning of infelix is actually unproductive. It's an agricultural metaphor, and it commonly applies to childless women. Remember, Dido is famously infelix. Her main problem is that she wants a baby, or one of her main problems. So likewise, the primary meaning of frui is to enjoy the produce of something. So Ovid uses here agricultural diction, not as metaphor of reproduction, but in reference to the crop of pleasures that stands in stark contrast with childbirth. A woman's private parts are a field from which both women and men ought to reap the fruits of joy, and both sexes should benefit from the equal distribution of erotic products. In Amoris 1:3-19, I'm giving you this passage in number 5 on the handout. Ovid asks his mistress to give herself to him as fertile subject matter for his for his poems, te mihi materiem felicem in carmina praebe, modified by the adjective felicem here, materiem clearly puns on matter. Okay, that's one of the ancient etymological links between materiis and matter. Lucretius famously has a wordplay on terra, mater, and materiis. So Ovid wants his mistress to become the mother of his poems, the children of an author in love. So female fertility will bless Ovid with poetic productivity, not with biological children. Now, going back to number 4 of the handout, one of the striking aspects of the first couplet is that the diction of the hexameter more appropriately suggests actually an impotent man than a frigid woman. The adjective infelix can be both masculine and feminine, and cui torped habet sile more readily evokes a man's unresponsive penis than a woman's unresponsive vagina or clitoris. So the punchline is a word puella at the end, which forces us to reinterpret the line as referring to female private parts. But the employment of diction that can describe the dysfunctional private parts of both men and women drives Ovid's point home. Both sexes should feel equal pleasure. Sex is not the locus in which the gender distinction between male and female is drawn, but a zone of indistinction in which the bodies of men and women form an inseparable unit. In the art of love, there is no qualitative or quantitative discrimination between sexes in the anatomy of pleasure. Now, in ancient medicine, female pleasure is actually almost always discussed in the context of conception. A woman's sexual health was closely associated with childbearing. Virgins who put off marriage and sexually active but barren women suffer from life-threatening diseases, as Plato mentions in the Timaeus. I'm giving you this on passage 6. That's just representative of the attitude of the ancient medical science, which from our perspective, because this stuff is completely crazy. Okay, so Plato refers to the womb as a creature desirous of childbearing, which suffers from various diseases if it remains without fruit long beyond the due season. So against the background of ancient medicine, which focused on the relationship between childbirth and female sexuality, Ovid makes pleasure an autonomous goal, further suggesting that childbearing undermines sexual joy because it makes the female body less attractive. Ovid uses the language and arguments of ancient doctors to deny the instrumentality of orgasm and establish the maximization of shared pleasure as an end in and of itself. Now, in the context of the pathology of love, the Praeceptor Amoris casts himself as an expert doctor. This is because amor is basically a disease, both in Latin lavellology and in ancient medicine. So that's why Ovid is basically a sex doctor, and just the title of Remedia Amoris highlights this. Both the Ars Amatoria and the Remedia draw repeatedly on the medicalization of amatory passion. Yet for the physicians, orgasm is a clinical problem of fertility or infertility. In exemplary reproductive sex, both partners reached orgasm at the same time, as Hippocrates points out, in On Generation. So Ovid repeatedly emphasizes the importance of mutual orgasm in the Ars Amatoria, but the goal here is to maximize pleasure, plena voluntas, not to have babies. Ovid's insistence that a man and a woman should feel equal pleasure in sex contrasts with the Hippocratic author who claims that a woman feels much less pleasure than a man during intercourse, even though her orgasm lasts longer. In the Hippocratic corpus, this appears in a passage that discusses what happens when a man and a woman climax simultaneously. And the topic of the Hippocratic treatise is offspring. So the discussion of sexual pleasure is in the context of conception. By contrast, the issue of conception is conspicuously absent in the Ars Amatoria. Now, the revolutionary nature of this approach can hardly be overestimated. Against the background of ancient medicine, which drew a close link between female sexuality and fertility, Ovid dissociates a woman's sexual pleasure from conception. So Ovid evokes medical discourse in order to emphasize that he belongs to this scientific field. but also suggests the extent to which he differs from other physicians. Similarly, the background of didactic poems and manuals on agriculture is crucial for understanding the tradition to which the Ars Amatoria belongs, as well as how Ovid's work differs from it. By using the future imperative for legally sanctioning a sexual position, Ovid echoes Cato's voice, who often uses imperatives in the De Agricultura. Roy Gibson notes that the future imperative is popular in utilitarian popular prose, but generally absent from literary didactic. So its presence in Ovid's work is quite striking. The archaic feeling of this form adds to the solemnity of Ovid's injections. Now, it's not something striking to note that fertile women are traditionally compared to fertile fields in classical literature. Let's see what happens with this in the Ars Amatoria, though. In Book 1, for instance, and I'm giving you this as passage 7, Ovid compares the various temperaments of women with different soils that support different plants. The section here is on cultus, and the word cultus plays with the agricultural meaning of the word and recasts it in the urban setting of Roman elegy. Cultus in its agricultural meaning is all about the cultivation of the field. In its urban setting, it refers to fancy dresses, actually. So Ovid plays with both meanings. Ovid's women are fields in need of cultivation. The Praeceptor draws a clear comparison between refined looks and cultivated soils. That's number 7 on the handout. I'll start with cultivation. Liber comes forth nicely from cultivated grapes, and the crops stand tall in cultivated soil. Clear reference to the agricultural metaphor here. But there is tension in this parallel. The rustic world of agriculture stands in sharp contrast with the sophisticated manners, the culture of the city. Rusticitas is anathema in the Ars Amatoria. But there is another equally striking incompatibility in the comparison. While women are commonly compared with fields in the context of childbirth, Ovid brings up the crops and cultivation of didactic poetry to stress that the culture of his female students has nothing to do with procreation. Agricultural labor, as parallel to childbearing, is the exception in the Ars Amatoria. When Ovid brings up this comparison, he reminds his female readers that childbirth is the enemy of their looks because it ages them faster. This is number 8 on your handout. Furthermore, childbearing too makes the season of youth even shorter. The field wears out through continual harvests. The concern about time here is Hesiodic, and the allusion to the works and days adds to the agricultural image. Just as a field loses its fertility after continuous harvesting and needs to lie fallow, childbirth ages a woman and thus makes her unattractive. The discrepancy in the comparison is subtle but very significant. It is the loss of attractiveness, not the loss of fertility, that is related to the aging effect of repeated childbirths. Unlike rich fields, the desideratum of Hesiodic and Virgilian didactic, female fertility is a necessary evil in Ovid. Labor, in the sense of childbirth, is the curse of Ovid's age. The wording about the brevity of youth contrasts with the instructions about the advantages of mature women. Ovid advises his female students to pursue Ovid advises his male students to pursue women with recently graying hair or even older, employing an agricultural metaphor. This is number 9 on your handout. Young men, both this age and the later one, are useful. The field will produce crops. That field should be sown. Now, if the field is the woman and the sowing is sexual intercourse, what do the crops stand for? The agricultural metaphor typically stands for offspring. That's already in Aeschylus's 7 Against Thebes, in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, but also in the passage from Plato's Timaeus that I gave you in the handout. But Ovid brings up the parallel to highlight his divergence. Old age produces pleasure, not children. The less fertile the female body is, the more productive of sexual joy. The adjective litus exemplifies the tension between fertility and pleasure. In the beginning of the Georgics, Virgil announces that he will sing of what makes the crops flourish, quid faciat laeta segedes. The adjective commonly describes rich or fertile soil and is used in this sense by Cato and Virgil. By contrast, a woman's cheerful demeanor, the femina laeta in the Ars Amatoria, is attractive to men who seek to enjoy lovemaking, not to father children. The reference to female joy contrasts with the grim matrons of Greek mythology. Andromache and Tecmessa, wives of Hector and Ajax, respectively. Now, the Praeceptor says that if they had not given birth, he could hardly believe they ever slept with their husbands. This is number 10 on the handout. I hardly believe, even though I'm forced to believe by childbirth, that you slept with your husband. I think it's part of Ovid's joke, or part of his sneering remark that Andromache and Tecmessa gave birth to only one son each. So if childbirth is the only proof of sexual intercourse, the evidence seems rather scanty. But the point is that childbirth is a ridiculous evidence of sexual intercourse. The rich fields of traditional didactic give way to the lush women of Ovid's school of love. So, by eroticizing agricultural didactic, Ovid gives a new and crucial twist to an old and tired metaphor. Work, labor, for instance, a key term of didactic poetry, acquires connotations of childbearing in the Ars Amatoria. Ovid already plays with the meaning of labor in Metamorphosis 9, when Alcmena in labor replaces Hercules' labors. Now, back to the Ars Amatoria, after the advice about the appropriate position for leaving stretch marks out of sight, the Praeceptor recommends the half-lying on the side position as a simple position and one that requires the least labor, as simplex minimique laboris. And the word laboris, last word of the hexameter, is the punchline that describes the job of lovemaking in the context of avoiding the unpleasant effects of giving birth. So women in labor both evoke and contrast with women who labor in bed. In his didactic poem, Ovid does not encourage hard work, but teaches how one can avoid it. And this sharply contrasts with Hesiod's Works and Days. But it may actually be even more interesting that the link between procreation and productivity already features in Hesiod. Leila Grace Canevaro points out that procreation in the Works and Days is seen in terms of productivity, analogous to planting or rearing animals. The fundamental interaction between agricultural labor and reproduction can be traced back to the origins of didactic poetry. Hesiod marks the right day for getting married and the appropriate days for the birth of male and female offspring. Issues of marriage and procreation are grafted into the right time for sowing and taming animals. Hesiod himself provides Ovid with a basis for combining the works of farming with the works of lovemaking. But this is imitation with difference. Childbirth is replaced with the crops of pleasure in Ovid. Now, I am running out of time, so I should probably conclude here. So Ovid assumes all sorts of different voices in the art of love. He assumes the voice of Hesiod, he assumes the voice of Lucretius, the voice of an authoritative legislator, he assumes the voice of a doctor or a sexpert, but he does all this in order to emphasize his departure from the traditional association of didactic poetry and medical discourse with issues of procreation and fertility. And when he assumes the voice of a censor of an Augustan jurist, he does that in order to stress that sexual behavior is entirely divorced from family ties and the prince's demographic concerns. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Ahora quedaría el espacio para las preguntas. Quizás sería bueno que podamos vernos todos. Me parece, yo veo ahora el handout. Y bueno, quizás haya un lugar para preguntas. Yo tengo preguntas, pero sería bueno que si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta antes, ¿no? Profesor Alighieri.
Sí, Professor Ziogas, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. One out of curiosity, where did you study in the United States?
I did my PhD at Cornell University.
Okay, because I'm talking to you from Lexington, Kentucky.
Ah, okay, good.
Okay.
Lucky you, you have Thanksgiving tomorrow.
Yes, yes, well, yeah, okay, yeah. The other question is this, if you are decoupling, para los que, primero lo digo en español, si estamos separando procreación de sexo, ¿qué dice Ovidio o qué dice el profesor Ziogas sobre las relaciones homosexuales? So, Professor Ziogas, I don't know if you understood my question. If you are decoupling or Ovidio is decoupling,
Yeah,
what about homosexuality? What advice do they have? Not for me, obviously, but for the people engaged in homosexual love or sex.
Thank you very much for your question. My colleague, Professor Jennifer Ingerhard, is actually studying the lesbian relationships in Ovid. So she's probably the person to ask. But my answer would be that one of the things about Ovid is that he is notoriously heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, he basically is not that keen on pederastic affairs, because he says that you can't climax at the same time in sex.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true as far as I'm told, but that's what Ovid says. Okay, so he's a bit awkward when it comes to this. But I think your question is important, because once you dissociate sex from procreation, then you basically open the door to welcome homosexual affairs once you do that. But Ovid, especially the art of love, is notoriously heterosexual.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
It is, and I would say Latin love elegy more generally. You have Marathus in Tibullus, the boy. Tibullus is in love with the boy Marathus, but you don't have much homoerotic affairs, and that's in contrast actually with Greek elegy, with Theognis, for instance.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Professor, could you not share the screen?
Oh, am I sharing the screen? I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry. How do stop share? Okay.
Okay. Yes.
That makes also things easier for me. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Ioannis, I have a question divided in two questions.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I read slowly because I want it to be understood. Is it possible to think that Ovid, by using legal language, the language of law, when he's dealing with love in his erotodidactic poetry, is in a way imprisoned in the terms of language of Augustan moral legislation, although his aims are in the opposite way?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, Pablo. That's a very good question. Okay, so if all this if we kind of follow pretty much what I said, that Ovid does this in order to show how different he is, how successful is this? Because the only means he has is to be trapped in this discourse. Okay, and that's the whole thing. I will kind of resist the temptation to refer to my own work, so I will refer to the book by Miller, Subjecting Verses, and he has a chapter about Ovid and the law there that actually makes precisely this point, that that Ovid basically needs Augustus, is trapped in this discourse. Whatever he does is a reflection of the dominant ideology. And then all of a sudden, elegiac poetry sounds less radical. But I would actually also beg to differ, because Ovid plays the other trick. He also wants Augustus to be trapped in his elegiac discourse. So he wants himself to, he styles himself in terms of Augustan ideology, but he also wants to trap Augustan ideology in the value system of Latin love elegy. It's a very good question, and there is no simple answer. And to be honest, I don't have any extremely strong views. So if you want to present Ovid as some sort of person who in the end cannot escape the dominant ideology, and as a result he reproduces it no matter how much he ironizes or parodies it, that's a pretty legitimate way of reading his poetry, basically.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is related to the first and assumes the validity of the presupposition, which is not sure, but I make the question. If this is possible, the first question, could we compare, beyond the obvious differences, Ovid's Ars Amatoria with Horace's Ars Poetica, the Praeceptor Amoris with the Praeceptor Literarum, taking into account the prescriptive nature of these two works, nature carried out in an innovative way, different from traditional agricultural, for example, not granted before to Romans?
Okay. Let me see if I understand your question. First, there is scope for comparing Ovid's didactic poetry with Horace, with his Ars Poetica, not just with his Ars Poetica, but also with his epistle to Augustus. I mean, Horace's epistle to Augustus, when Ovid wrote Tristia II, his letter to Augustus, and this is a poem from which Horace is resoundingly absent, but his absence makes it even more clear that Ovid had Horace in mind when he wrote this. Now, Horace writes the Ars Poetica, and Ovid, I mean, you never know with Ovid whether he is actually in love or in love with poetry. So the kind of whatever his instructions about love are basically heavily poetic. So I see very, very clear parallels there between Ovid and Horace. I mean, Horace is the one who brings up the tension between morality and aesthetics. And he basically says that to Augustus, what's the point if someone praises you, but the person praising you is a bad poet? That's no praise at all. And then again, well, my satire may be aggressive and biting and offensive, but what if it's good poetry? Then Caesar should approve of it. So, and Ovid really builds on it. So there is a lot between Ovid and Horace, but I confess that maybe you were getting at something else that I didn't quite follow. Could you elaborate on your point?
Okay, it's Ovid is the Praeceptor Amoris, and Horace is the Praeceptor Literarum, and that are two innovative ways in Latin literature, different from one traditional way of making literature related to Cato, for example, and to afterwards Virgil, that is agricultural way. And because of that, they are related at least because they aim at a new way of making literature. One in the field of love, and the other in the field of poetry. And this is naturally beyond the obvious differences. In this way, these are two prescriptive ways of making literature too, because we have a prescriptive poem, The Art of Love, and another prescriptive poem,
Yeah,
Ars Poetica.
Yes, you're right. They are definitely pushing boundaries, and they do stand out as we don't think of poetry nowadays as something that basically gives you tips or gives you practical advice or something that tells you what to do. Okay, but as you say, both Horace and Ovid are actually pretty prescriptive. They kind of push the boundaries of poetry, and that's why they are really getting close to non-poetic discourses like the law, when they say this is what you do, this is what you must do. But in terms of offering all their instructions in prosaic manuals, they're actually writing very, very fine poetry.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers and for the lecture generally. It was very clear. I think it was very clear and very, as I said before, very inspiring, because we are thinking about it after your words. And I don't know if there is any questions. Another question. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta para hacer?
Me. Maybe, sorry, Ioannis, maybe it's a silly question, but
there is no such a thing as a silly question.
Okay. I was thinking about the audience of the book.
Yes.
The kind of woman, no matrons woman, the model, and well, I want to know what do you think about that and the thing of pleasure.
That's certainly not a silly question. The audience or the readership of the Ars Amatoria is one of the main, I don't want to say problems, but Ovid makes it the fascinating thing. So first, you have him pretending to say the respectable women are excluded from this. Only when he says that he actually doesn't exclude women, he gets rid of clothes that signify the status. And then he actually keeps blaring those boundaries. All women are invited, all women can do this, all women can do that. I think my answer about the audience is that the way you have to think about Ovid is a very ambitious and very aggressive poet. He's not selling his work to a predetermined type of woman. He actually wants to create his own type of woman. And that's what's extraordinary there, okay? That he undresses them at the beginning, and then he wants to shape women in the image of his desire. And that's another thing that makes him very, very similar to Augustus, because Augustan legislation also wanted to define women and polarize them into different social groups, different moral groups. So Ovid is actually creating his ideal woman. He's creating his audience and his readership. Others would say, I should probably mention this, and because that's also a legitimate point, that there is a hidden and an unhidden audience, that Ovid pretends to instruct women, but he basically serves male interests. So whatever he does in the end ultimately serve the interests of men. I'm not entirely sure. I'm convinced about this, but there is the different levels of audiences is there, and Augustus is a hidden audience right from the beginning of the Ars Amatorium. So the question of the audience is very important. There are very many different levels, and Ovid tries to please all of them, but in the end gets in trouble.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bueno, y esperamos también que esta audiencia haya sido la adecuada y haya recibido, bueno, con interés el trabajo que tan generosamente el profesor, vuelvo a repetir, presentó en nuestras jornadas, y que es un trabajo también nuevo, ¿no? Es decir, algo sobre lo cual está estudiando en este momento. Esperamos poder, como dije al principio, poder recibirlo en algún momento de manera presencial. Sigo insistiendo, esto es un sustituto, ¿no? Es un sustituto valioso porque nos permite hacer estas jornadas, pero yo quiero agradecerle personalmente y espero que pueda entender algo de mi español, que no es muy bueno, pero es un poco mejor, al menos que el inglés. Que agradecemos mucho su buena disponibilidad, su generosidad, y que lo esperamos en el futuro para próximas jornadas o próximos seminarios, próximos cursos, el curso internacional, por ejemplo, que está suspendido. Yo voy a despedirlo al profesor y después le dejo a Guillermina la despedida general, si puedes.
No.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we see in the future, I don't know, we see in the following jornadas, you will be our guests, I hope.
Thank
Soon,
you very much.
Soon.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed, and I'll end just as I started. It's my only regret is not meeting you in person.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bueno, no sé si tal vez alguien quería hacer una pregunta. Nosotros, con los medios que tenemos, los podríamos haber ayudado. Bueno, ahora se fue el profesor, pensé que se iba a quedar. Pero bueno, ya saben, para la próxima, tal vez para la exposición del profesor Wheeler de la tarde, si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta, nos la dice en español. Nosotros, con las herramientas que tenemos, se la decimos al profesor. ¿Sí? Siempre hay formas de comunicarse. ¿Sí? Nos vieron a nosotros también sacando un poco de todos lados. Así que bueno, les agradecemos a todos y nos vemos a la tarde. ¿Sí?
Pronto.
Gracias por estar. Nos vemos.
Chao, gracias.
Chao, chao.